All right. I am Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I manage the Forest Connect program. And one of the activities of this program is the monthly webinar series we've been running now for several years, and we're joined by um, great speakers such as we have today. And that makes it great for me. It's easy for me. I do an introduction, then I sit back and I listen and I learn, just like you're going to do. So today we're joined by Dr. Kimberly Bohn, who received her master's in 2001 and PhD in 2005 through the State University of New York system, looking at forest resource management, focusing on silviculture of northern hardwoods. Then she spent about a decade in Florida as an associate professor of forest ecology and silviculture, and has more recently come back to the Northeast in Pennsylvania, where she works as an extension forester out of McKean County, working with private woodland owners and foresters. And I met Kimberly at a meeting of extension foresters last December, and she had mentioned some of the things she was interested in, particularly in managing native and non-native plants, which is always a very popular topic with this audience. And I convinced her, which was pretty easy. I just asked, and she said yes. She would be willing to give a webinar for us, and so she has, and she is. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kimberly, who will talk with us about the legacy of beech and beech understory interference. So Kimberly, welcome. Thank you very much. And I'm going to mute my microphone. I'll just hover in the background and learn. So it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone, for joining me. So as Peter mentioned, I did do my graduate work up at the State University of New York, and actually my master's thesis was on understory beech. So I've been working with beech since 1999, actually, and after working for some time in pines and lines, I like to call it, down in Florida, I was missing my hardwood, so I had to come back, and it turns out I'm still working with beech. So what I wanted to do, let's see if I can advance the slide here. Oops, there we go. Is really start by talking about a review of the stages of beech bark disease and that legacy of beech bark disease throughout the decades, particularly with a focus on the stand dynamics in the aftermath forest. So that's what most of us are dealing with now. And then I'll transition and talk a little bit about some of the control methods for understory beech. But in particular, I want to put it into context to some of the overall challenges and considerations we have for managing beech and practicing long-term silviculture at the same time. So as you're familiar, beech bark disease is a complex between an insect and a pathogen. So the insect is a scale, the Cryptococcus phagosuga. It's very commonly detected because you see those nice little white puffballs on the bark of the tree. That's a good indication that you have the scale. And then that's followed up, and what actually kills the tree is a neonectria fungus. And you can see in the middle picture there is sort of a diagram of sort of the orange fungus that eventually leads to the disease. And I'm sure many of you have seen many of these trees on the right when it's been infected and eventually dies. So there are a few stages actually of the beech bark disease and the progression through a stand. And the first stage is called the advance front. And that's when the beech scale is really arriving into a new area and beginning sort of a rapid expansion. You see a rapid expansion of the population. You see more evidence on the trees that there's the scale is there. But there's actually, at this point, very little evidence of the neonectria impact. So we just have the impact of the beech scale, and again, that doesn't actually lead to the mortality. So in that very initial stage, you will see little to no beech mortality. And you've probably seen this diagram already in terms of how this has manifested itself across the Northeast. So it was first detected in Nova Scotia in sort of the early 1900s, moved through Maine, down through Vermont, New Hampshire, Vermont, eastern New York, through the 30s, and then the 60s, into western New York then, and sort of just maybe a little decade later. Now has moved now into Pennsylvania more recently, so in the 2000s. And now we're actually starting to see additional outbreaks or detections of the beech scale in other places like Ohio, even the Michigan Peninsula, and you'll see there's even a small pocket down there in the Smoky Mountain region. And what's interesting now is with this detection that we're seeing now in the late 2000s is that we're seeing actually, you see that it's not all contiguous, that distribution. And so there is some movement likely of the scale that's from humans and vehicles and so forth. So really seeing still to this day an expansion of the beech scale. So the second stage of the disease is what's called the killing front, and that's where the scale infestation really starts out, again, pretty heavily and widespread in the area. As the killing front moves through, and after a decade or so, the scale will eventually die back, but this is where you see that increase in severity of the neonectria infections, and these are where the neonectria infections increase to their highest levels. And it's through this killing front stage that you'll see pretty much, I would say 90 to 100% of the beech impacted. And there has been some documentation of resistant beech, and it's still at very low levels. Maybe 2% of the population has been resistant to the beech bark disease. So during that killing front, it can take actually time to see complete mortality of mature trees. So in the first 2 years, perhaps about 20% mortality of mature trees. And it takes about 10 years even to see maybe 50% of mortality. And perhaps almost 2 decades to see that 100% mortality. So this is not, you know, a quick thing. This has been, and those of you in the more northern states are familiar with this. This has been going on for a very long time. And during this initial killing front, really the major trees that are susceptible to mortality are really the overstory trees, and estimated around maybe the sort of 11 inches, sort of a bit of a threshold in terms of trees that will show that will eventually succumb to mortality versus those that linger on. This third stage, which I would say a lot of us are in right now, is what's called the aftermath forest. And so this is that period of time after you see the significant mortality of the overstory trees. So this is probably, again, you know, 10 to 20 years after the killing front has moved through. And so at this point, you really do see the increased canopy gaps from the mortality of overstory trees. A lot of you have seen this already for decades. We tend to see a lot of beech snap as well. So those trees have a tendency to snap and create snags, which is not necessarily a bad thing to have snags in the forest, but we see, again, a lot of that overstory mortality. What we also see, and this is actually a big part of the problem of the aftermath forest, is these lingering disease trees that are, again, smaller than the overstory, smaller than 11 inches. So these are the ones that are in our mid-story, our sapling classes, and smaller. And these trees will linger for a long time. And I think this picture actually shows a good illustration, is that particularly during the initial decades of the aftermath forest, you'll see these lingering trees in sort of varying levels of severity and disease. And so you can see this one on the left side, you know, it has a couple of pock marks, and it's obviously got the cankers from the neonectria, but it's not terrible. And then the one on the right is obviously much further along. So even throughout the aftermath forest, which again lasts for decades now, you still will maintain, or you'll still see low levels of the scale and the neonectria persist. So you're always going to have very sort of slow infestations, these lingering trees that, these are the ones actually we probably want them to die, and they persist. And of course, I think this is what we're all familiar with too. Another legacy then of this beech bark disease in the aftermath forest is this proliferation, really, of what we call beech thickets, right? So I think we have all seen this, just numerous amounts of root sprouts that have been developing in these aftermath forests following the mortality of the overstory trees. And I'm sure many of you have seen just forests just completely full of beech in the understory. And this picture is another illustration of that. So if you look in the background, all those small orange trees is the beech in the fall, and they actually retain their leaves much longer than other species in the fall. So it's really easy to spot a forest that's has an understory dominated by beech in the fall, because it has this nice brilliant orange color. There have also been some questions in terms of the aftermath forest, in terms of how much of that understory is really root suckers versus seedlings. And there's been a number of studies that have looked at this to quantify how much are actually coming from root suckers versus seedlings. And most of the studies found that for the most part, in fact, in most stands, between 60 and 90% of the stems in the understory are coming from root sucker origin off of these dying and lingering beech that are in the progression of the disease. But there are a few stands that actually can have as much as 75% seedling origin. Those are pretty rare, though. But beech, even the beech now in the aftermath forest that's diseased and lingering, actually still can produce beech nuts. And we do still see some mass seeding of beech nuts, sometimes even on the order of 500,000 little nuts per acre have been reported. And in fact, actually last year was a pretty good beech nut year as well. And so there are some, in terms of a wildlife benefit, obviously beech nuts provide that mass that maybe isn't being replaced by some other species. And so there are some people that are concerned about maintaining that beech nut component into our forests, even the aftermath forests. In terms of spatial distribution of the beech throughout a stand in the aftermath forest, what we find is basically that beech tends to be clustered around usually the dead canopy trees or the highly diseased cankered beech trees. And in fact, this is a study way back from the late 80s. Basically, Jones and Raynal found that the majority of root suckers, in fact, do develop within about a 30-foot radius of parent trees. And so if you look across a stand, sometimes you will see a very sort of clustered or variable distribution of beech in an understory, and it can sometimes be dependent on how much root sucker development has formed around any of those lingering beech in the aftermath forest. So sometimes obviously you have very, very dense patches, and then you could have places maybe where there wasn't beech in an overstory where you wouldn't have much root sucker development. So what makes understory beech problematic is that we all know it's very shade tolerant, and of all the sort of shade tolerant species in our northern hardwoods, it usually grows the best in those shaded conditions, and sometimes even in partially shaded conditions too. So we're most concerned a lot of times about competition with sugar maple, which is also shade tolerant. But in most cases, and in a lot of cases, beech really will perform better than sugar maple. It'll get that advantage, except for maybe in the biggest of gap openings. And so in shaded conditions, it has greater vertical growth than sugar maple. You can see here almost double the vertical growth per year than sugar maple in the shade. And also another important component is it actually has greater lateral growth, almost 3 times greater lateral growth. And many of you may have seen this in the forest, where you see these sort of the lower limbs and branches, they really spread out pretty far horizontally. And so that can have some implication, again, thinking about competition in that understory, is that they just physically take up a lot of space, not only the vertically, but horizontally. And what makes them such good growers in the shade is that they are able to have a more efficient leaf display, and that horizontal growth helps with that. So they're really able to capture all those little light flecks in the understory and respond and grow. So what I wanted to show here actually now is the progression of the aftermath forest. So I mentioned that this aftermath forest is going to be around with us for a long time. And so we'll actually see sort of different levels of development depending on how far along you are into that aftermath phase. And that's one thing that really struck me when I moved back to Pennsylvania, because as I mentioned, I started working on beech in upstate New York in 1999. So that's, going back, that's almost, not quite, but almost 2 decades ago. And when I moved back to Pennsylvania, I found I was getting a lot of the same questions we were asking ourselves in New York about 2 decades ago. And you can see, if you look at the map, you could see that, we are about, a decade and a half maybe past what's been going on in New York State. And I'm actually, if you look at the map of the United States on the bottom right corner, there's a little white area in the sort of north central part of Pennsylvania. That's where I work. And actually I think we have now achieved aftermath forest state. So we have caught up here even as well. But it's interesting because I still get a lot of questions about, are these resistant beech? And I often say likely not. It's likely that we're just not as far along in the aftermath forest phase, and we're starting to we don't always see the full impact of the mortality on those lingering beech yet, so those mid-story beech. And in fact, there are you can see some structural differences as you progress through the decades of living with this aftermath forest. So in those first few decades, after the killing front has moved through and you're in that aftermath phase with the lingering mid-story beech and the sprouts, you see those mid-story beech persisting, sometimes, again, for a couple decades. So you might not get complete mortality. They may linger around. And then you see, as many of you in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York have seen, through those decades, you'll see an increase in the beech sprouts, the root suckering. And so those over time are increasing in diameter and height, almost getting into sapling sizes. And this is sort of that point where we start to see that increased understory competition with other more desirable species. And this was the concern for a long time. As we progress, so again, some of those northern states have been dealing with this for a long time. What's interesting is, I think the difference now is that some of those lingering beech from the initial killing front are actually dying, that those mid-story beech are dying, but what's coming up in its place is obviously more beech. So those sprouts, those beech thickets that we saw develop in the early stages of the aftermath forest, without management, are continuing to grow in size. And some of those sprouts now, if you're working in a forest that hasn't been managed, are going to actually now get into these lower and mid canopy positions. And again, because the scale and nectria are present in very low level populations, they do also eventually succumb to the disease, but more slowly. So now we have beech in the not only in the understory, but reaching mid-story sizes as well. So this obviously has a pretty significant impact on desirable species and their development in that stand. And just to show a couple of examples of how prevalent beech is in sapling stages now, I just have a couple of statistics from some various states. So this is some statistics from Vermont from 2015, so just a couple of years ago. So you can see beech, again, is the #1 species in the understory in terms of millions of saplings. It's just over 400 millions of saplings in Vermont. Here's New York, my previous home state, and you can see again at this point, this is 2012, beech again in the sapling stages, so these are 1 to 5 inches, has sort of reached that #1 position. And you can see actually back in 1993, and even as late as 2007, it was actually #3, so red maple and sugar maple were still ahead at that point. But now, again, particularly in areas without understory management, beech has increased, and it's been actually a 24% increase in that time frame. And this is my new home state of Pennsylvania, and these are actually seedlings, so it's not actually saplings, but looking at seedling abundance throughout Pennsylvania from a few years ago. And actually, this again, American beech just rose to #1. It's only marginally and probably not even statistically significantly different than red maple, but it is up there. And of course, red maple is an issue for us in some of our oak stands. So there's some concern about red maple too in some places. Of course, I want to point out that this proliferation of beech that we see, this dominance of beech that we see, is obviously a lot of it is driven by the aftermath forest and the beech bark disease, but there are other confounding factors. For those of you that live in states with high deer densities, you know that deer prefer to eat the things we want, and it tends to leave beech alone. And so that has contributed to shifts in species composition that favor beech. Obviously, depending on where you are in the landscape in terms of soil conditions or elevation, beech will become more dominant. Sugar maple, again, likes it has a higher nutrient requirement, so requires richer soils. And then also, again, think about the land use history. So the amount of beech you see in a particular forest is going to be affected by any previous land use history and any intensity and frequency of management in those stands. And it's interesting, I think, for people that got on the bandwagon early and really recognized beech, understory beech in the aftermath forest as being a problem, have been able to make some significant changes. And this is a study from Bill Leake that was published in 2006 and done in New Hampshire, I believe. And he was looking at 50 years of single tree selection. So this was in an uneven age northern hardwood where they were specifically selecting out beech to removing diseased beech and trying to promote other desirable species and anything that might look to be resistant. And so in those stands after 50 years, 70% of the beech or the basal area in beech has disease-free bolls, whereas compared to either unmanaged stands, so these were stands that hadn't had any kind of silvicultural activity for 100 years, or those that were clear-cut about 50 years, so at that same point where the aftermath forest was just beginning, they actually saw, again, sort of the opposite. You have 60%, so over half of the beech or the basal area in beech is diseased. So regular management to control some of this beech can help help control some of the understory and also the amount of disease-free boles or trees that you would have in the stand. But I think the big question for a lot of us is that, we are not dealing with forests that have been regularly managed for the last 50 years or have maybe been managed but not quite as often. And so the real question is, what do we do with these aftermath forests? And as I mentioned, I looked at this long time ago. And that was, again, in New York. When I was up in New York in the late 1990s, there was sort of this idea that maybe there is a minimum threshold value at which understory beech would either become dominant or not become dominant. I was looking at selection system on uneven northern hardwoods. So we wanted to know, maybe is there some small level of beech that could be left in the stand without leading to understory dominance by that species. And so I was looking at some species importance values. So we weighted all of the different species in the understory based on their relative density, and weighted by height class, knowing that height would be a good indicator of development into a higher canopy class. And really we found, so we looked at the change over time, over 10 years, from beech before a selection system and afterwards. And really what we did is lumped it together into sort of dominant classes. So even this medium category, which is in the middle, I say medium, but it was actually that range was really as low as 25% of importance value of beech in a stand. And we found that even when it's as low as 25% importance value in the stand, there was a good 50-50 chance that it was going to actually become dominant and move into much higher classes in the future. And of course, the more beech you have to start with, the more you're going to end up with. And I think that's still evident today, and probably more so today. In fact, I found a few quotes from some recent articles that basically said, where understory beech exists, beech will prevail. And that is independent of whether you're working in an even-age forest or an uneven-age forest. That's independent of the types of treatments you do. So a number of studies looked at both shelterwood treatments, selection system for uneven-aged northern hardwoods, some fancier treatments to add structural complexity. And all of these studies found that where they had understory beech, that was going to be dominant. Didn't matter what the treatment was, or the silvicultural treatment was. So again, what do we do with the aftermath forest? I just want to remind you that it can actually depend on what stage you are in the aftermath forest. So again, I kind of want to remind our guests from Pennsylvania is to think about the fact that we are not very far along, and that you actually might see more understory beech development in the future. Those lingering trees are still going to persist for a while. They're going to send up more root suckers. And so we're in a little bit of a different phase than maybe Maine and some of those northern states. And I think I'll also make this point in terms of dealing with beech in our aftermath forests, is that, like a lot of other interfering vegetation, is that this vegetation management of beech is really going to need to become sort of the norm. So it needs to really be a regular and repeated silvicultural activity. And I'll go back to, when I was in graduate school, we were sort of still in that time period where we really only thought about regeneration and what's in the understory when we were ready to regenerate that next age class or to do a uneven age treatment. And I think now we're at a point that we have so many things going on in our understory that it really needs to be thought about all the time. constantly at every stage of a forest need to be thinking about what that next forest might be. And so that means doing more of this understory vegetation management as a regular part of the long-term silvicultural prescription for a forest. And treatment, the treatment efficacy and efficiency of treating beech is really going to depend on the size and density of stems, or even the variation in sizes. So, if you're thinking about dealing with some of those lingering parent trees and their root suckers. And so that's, again, why it's important to really think about where you are in terms of the progression of the aftermath forest. Is, what size ranges of beech are you dealing with? Are you primarily dealing with beech thickets? Or are you dealing with both the lingering beech and beech thickets? Or maybe you're just dealing with those thickets that have now grown up into mid-story sizes. So for the dense but small stems, obviously sort of in that thicket phase, foliar applications can be pretty effective and efficient. And when I put this together, I think I was thinking about the private landowner and what they can do. So a lot of these recommendations are really applicable for a private landowner to do. Obviously, on a small scale, you could use a backpack sprayer. I do know a lot of landowners that also have mounted mist blowers, that they have mounted on their ATVs, which would obviously reach taller heights if you have very small stems, so like less than 1 inch, but have reached, a height that's somewhat over head height. And glyphosate is probably, particularly for the private landowner, is probably still the most effective chemical to use out there. And it doesn't have to be a very high rate. Usually, like with a lot of hardwood control, in the range of 2 to 5% volume to volume. And you would actually, with glyphosate, need to add in a surfactant. So a lot of the formulations now do have a surfactant built in. So that's just something you would need to look at the label for. And I'm going to throw this out there, and I'll be interested to see what people have to share on just doing mechanical treatments. I know there's a lot of places where maybe herbicides are frowned upon. I know there are some private landowners that would not like to use chemicals. And it is, it has been suggested that you can sort of bush hog or mow down, particularly at the thicket phase. The problem with beech and a lot of actually woody stems is that they just basically resprout. So you can give it a try. I always tell this to private landowners. You can give it a try, but it's obviously going to take multiple treatments, and by multiple, I mean, over the next 5 or 10 years to really knock things back. So the idea is that, you cut down the trees and even bigger ones while they're actively growing, and you are trying to work at reducing that root reserve, so any of the photosynthate reserves in the root system. I guess after living in the South for a while, we do a lot of herbicide work, and that's why a lot of my recommendations will probably be for more on the herbicide treatment. I think they are a little bit more efficient and effective than mechanical treatments. So the other herbicide treatments that can be done with beech, particularly the larger beech, so now we're maybe out of the thicket phase, but thinking about more of the individual stem treatments, are either a basal bark treatment or a hack and squirt, usually for larger stems. And so the basal bark treatment, if you're not familiar with it, is just essentially applying the herbicide about 1 foot to 1.5 feet around the base of the tree. And for this treatment, triclopyr is the most commonly recommended herbicide at about 10 to 20% solution. This one has to be applied in an oil. So the oil is what actually helps carry basically the herbicide through the bark and then into the tree. And this can be done actually at any time during the year. And then the other common one, and probably what I recommend a little bit more is the hack and squirt method. So essentially, it's just like it says, you hack into the bark, and depending on the size of the tree, you may actually need two or more hacks or frills. And then essentially you're squirting the herbicide then into that open hack. And this can typically be done with glyphosate. You'll probably see out in the literature the typical recommendation is to use 40 to 50% solution of glyphosate, which sounds high to some people. In fact, when I talk to farmers that are used to spraying glyphosate on their fields at much lower rates, they're often concerned. But remember, this is a really concentrated solution. You're only using a very small amount in a very small area. And this is one, they say you could really apply it all year, although you don't actually want to do this treatment when, particularly in the spring when the sap's flowing up. What you want to have happen is for the herbicide to translocate down into the root system. And so I've seen sort of best recommendations for doing this type of treatment anywhere between June and November, so the active growing season, but again, even into late November. And just a couple of comments about each of these treatments. In terms of the basal bark treatment, on the trees that you actually treat, it can be pretty effective. And so one thing about basal bark treatments is you can technically go down and apply these to stems as small as 1 inch. So perhaps if you have some of those, those lingering beech that are, a few inches in diameter, and then a couple other smaller sprouts around in saplings, you can go and individually treat each of those using a basal bark treatment. But it does get pretty costly and not very efficient, again, if you're dealing with a high density of those small stems, those 1 inch stems. So this is, it's a good sort of spot, I would say, call it like a spot application. And then the hack and squirt is also really effective, and this is the one that I usually recommend to private landowners, again, for the bigger lingering beech that are around, those mid-story trees. You can treat small trees using this method. It's generally more for larger trees, 5 to 6 inches. But what's good about this particular treatment, particularly when you can effectively get that movement of the herbicide into the root system, is that you can actually, there's been some studies looking at just treating the larger parent trees and the effect on those root suckers that are attached, and you can actually kill about maybe 50% of the attached root suckers under 1 inch using this method. And that's one thing I've at least heard from a lot of landowners in terms of the basal bark treatments, is that you really don't have that translocation, so you have to treat each stem individually, where here this might actually be a good initial treatment to just go after those sort of larger lingering beech, and work on, use that also to kill some of the root suckers. So I will also mention that, this is not a one-time treatment, so we'll probably have to go back and do some follow-up to do some spraying of those smaller root suckers that weren't killed initially. But that's a way to maybe minimize some of the foliar application that you might do on those smaller stems. And then the cut stump treatment too is very effective. Again, sort of a 50 to 60% glyphosate solution is a recommendation. I have heard you can actually go a little bit lower than that if you're concerned about using something at such a high concentration. I have actually, at least anecdotally, heard that if you can go to about 30% solution and still be effective, not only in obviously killing the initial tree, but again, that herbicide translocates and kills off some of the attached root sprouts. What's good about a cut stump treatment as opposed to sort of the hack and squirt treatment is that if you do actually need to free up some growing space, this is obviously going to do that a lot faster than just having the the standing sort of snags, which, as I mentioned before, also has its benefits. But if you have, perhaps you have some desirable regeneration mixed in, this would be a good way to maybe release some of that desirable regeneration and get that established. And in terms of, there's been a lot of research also looking at, can we just mechanically cut these larger stems? And I would say it's probably not going to control the root suckering, so you're always going to have to come back and deal with that. But if you have some well-established advanced regeneration, this might be a method that helps give that a little bit of a head start. And that's actually sort of what I wanted to transition into now and talk about implications of understory beech treatments in terms of the larger sort of silvicultural perspective, in terms of how those stands develop. And this picture actually is from a treatment I was involved with back in 2000, where we did some just mechanical cutting of understory beech, and you can see how prolific it was in the stand and how much light it actually brought in once the trees were removed. And we did actually have at least a short-term sugar maple response, which is what we were after. But I think now, particularly being back in the Northeast now and seeing the number of invasive insects and invasive plants that we have, I think there is a real question to just keep in mind, you have this increased release. So what are you actually releasing with this increased light? And this is, I've again heard from a number of people that say, well, I got rid of all my understory beech and now I have fern. So we have a lot of problems with fern and black birch in Pennsylvania, and of course throughout the Northeast we have a number of invasive plants, garlic mustard, buckthorn, multiflora rose. And so again, this is not just to treat the beech once and walk away, but it actually requires some pretty consistent monitoring and treatment, because it is very likely that you can get rid of your beech and then just introduce something else that you don't want. And so you need to really be actively monitoring your forests even after treatments. Some other implications for understory beech treatment, particularly in these areas that have been affected by beech for a long time, where there hasn't been much treatment, is that just like in the previous picture, when you do remove that understory beech, and sometimes in these later stages almost mid-story beech, is that you're really shifting that distribution of foliage through the canopy classes. And this was another picture actually where there was it wasn't just understory, obviously. There was some mid-story beech hack and squirt and treatments and cut stump treatments. You can see it really pretty much opened up the entire stand right there. So you're almost, in this case, almost, it almost looks like a regeneration method. It's not even an understory treatment at this point. And this can actually also have implications in if you're working in uneven aged northern hardwoods, right? You're really shifting the age or size class distribution throughout the stand, and you have to think again, how is that going to manifest itself as that stand develops? You maybe have to delay future treatments to get another age class established, or think about some other treatments to do. So as I mentioned, this affects the timing of those subsequent silvicultural treatments and activities. And I think, and I've seen this more and more, is that in these areas where the beech bark disease has been there for decades, the aftermath forest has progressed for decades without much management, is that now going back into those stands, they're really almost being treated as if it was some, a degraded forest that was really in need of a restoration treatment. And we think about degraded forests because of high grading and diameter limit cutting, but they also can be degraded because of natural insects or diseases. And so it's almost, you have to take that more of a restoration approach, that maybe you're not going to have the productivity level that you would, like to have at this point, but you need to move that forest in some kind of a recovery mode. So you're really trying to just accelerate the recovery of any structure or function or diversity, knowing that maybe some of the original objectives might need to be delayed. And in some cases, like this picture here, maybe it's almost like a salvage operation for this stand. What can you really recover, or is it maybe more worthwhile to try to start again somehow? And there are a number of, I think, this is I call them sort of creative silvicultural approaches, and I think we're seeing the shift now with silvicultures. It's not just the traditional, shelterwood method or thinning, but we're really trying to utilize different approaches even within a single stand. So perhaps in a stand that is dominated by beech, doing crop tree releases to free up any desirable species that are maybe in the mid to upper canopy classes that are being affected by beech, or maybe doing some high intensity and thinning in the mid-story and understory and other places. And in fact, I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift also in terms of thinking about what I would call more of a micro stand level management. So traditional silviculture, we treat the stand entirely the same way. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, beech can be patchy in a forest. So it depends on how much of that regeneration is coming from the root suckers versus seedlings, how much of that lingering mid-story beech you had in your forest. And so there's sort of a shift to think about, maybe treating those patches of beech differently. Maybe in some areas you just do some understory vegetation management. In other areas it might be, the beech might be so developed that maybe it's worthwhile to think about moving to maybe just sort of a micro mini shelterwood method. And so you see a lot of sort of variability even in the management prescriptions within a single stand. So if I haven't depressed you enough already, I wanted to just end on this, which is, I sort of put as a question mark stage 4 for beech bark disease in terms of there now being some evidence of a second killing front coming through. And this has really been observed in Maine, and obviously those areas that have had dealt with beech bark disease for a long time. Is they're actually, unfortunately, now starting to see a second wave of beech mortality. So all of those root suckers and beech thickets that were left untreated and have left to develop into mid-story classes are now starting to actually succumb to, it's a second wave of the beech bark disease. So what they're seeing is actually increased levels of both the scale and the neonectria. So not just the low level that are sort of persistent with the aftermath forest. And it has been, this is not a progressive movement, of the disease like we saw before in the last several decades. This tends to occur more at very local, isolated populations, but it has been observed in several areas. And again, it's primarily been observed where the aftermath forest has persisted for over 60 years. And so you can see in this figure on the right, that's sort of, it's primarily Maine right now, but pretty soon that's going to be, New Hampshire and Vermont and eastern New York. And now the mortality, instead of being limited to just overstory trees, is really pretty consistent across all size classes. And it's interesting because Dave Houston wrote an article in 1975 which basically predicted that this was going to happen. And it was entitled "The Aftermath Forests Are Structured for a New Outbreak." So I think, there were some people on the forefront that really foresaw that this was going to occur. And just two examples from Maine that are experience this increased detection of the scale and neonectria and increased beech mortality. There's actually two distinct regions. One is in eastern Maine, and this is, again, where that aftermath forest has been well established, and you're getting that second killing front on the sprouts now from those original disease trees. The other area is actually along the Maine-Quebec border, and this is an area that actually had escaped the initial killing front several decades ago. And what they're finding now is that with a few prolonged mild winters, so there were some mild winters between 2002 and 2004, and this actually is what led to the increase in scale population in that new region. So now they're seeing mortality not only in the aftermath forest, but in places that may have escaped it in the past. And so, you know, as we see variation and shifts in climate and milder winters, which we didn't experience this year, but as we see that variability maybe in weather patterns, we may begin to see some more development of the scale and the neonectria again. So I just want to conclude with this, and if any of you have had the opportunity to hear Ralph Nyland speak, this is one of his many favorite sayings, and which I also like to use is, you know, when he talks about managing northern hardwoods, the key things are to shoot the deer, obviously poison the beech, and then manage the light. So with that, I did put a slide up with all the literature that I cited, if anyone's interested in reading that. I think these slides are available, or if not, I can make at least this slide available for people. And with that, I will say thank you, and I think we'll entertain any questions that come up, and I think I will stop sharing so that I can read the chat.
Great job, Kimberly. Thank you very much. So you do have lots of questions.
Okay.
And I'll start. I always take the host prerogative. I get the first one. And so if the others have questions, this is the time to type them in. There are several questions that have already been typed in, so we have lots of fodder for discussion. But on the fourth front, the second wave of the killing front that's killing the sprouts, is there any reason to think that there's going to be a reduction in the amount of sprout development? Or is it too early to tell?
I think it's a little bit too early to tell, yeah. Oops. Am I still on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm clicking too many buttons. I'm going to stop clicking.
That would be my fear also. So can you see the chat window?
No, that's what I'm looking for right now.
Okay.
Oh. Oh. But you can keep asking me questions. You can verbally listen.
Okay. All right. So I will. Do you want me to start asking their questions that came in earlier, or do you want to find those? Okay.
Oh, okay.
So, do you want to comment on? There was a link given to as I recall, Michigan State University pub about climate change. And then there's also more recently a Journal of Applied Ecology article about climate change impacts on beech. I don't remember if it's beech bark disease or beech sprout formation. Any thoughts about that? Are you familiar with those publications, or how would you react to that?
I'm not familiar with the one out of Michigan, actually. What was the question again?
So is climate change having any impact on the beech trees?
Oh, yeah. I think in terms of impact to the beech trees themselves, I would probably say not. But where it is having the impact again is in the shifts, maybe in the insect and the pathogen.
And it's so where you get warmer conditions, then that's favoring the insect and the pathogen.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And then you were talking mostly about rural forest lands. Any thoughts about how to manage the aftermath of dead beech trees in urban forests?
Oh, um, that's a good question. I think that I would say almost a similar approach, because you're going to, I mean, they're going to develop the sprouts, and the lingering beech are going to develop in the same way. And so they're probably doing some of those individual stem treatments are going to be important. I would say maybe on an urban landscape, it's important to consider more of the safety aspects of those trees that are lingering and dying. And in that case, perhaps, doing a hack and squirt is probably not going to be great if you're going to have, snags, obviously.
Right. Oops.
So, but the cut stump treatments would certainly be applicable.
Are there any any treatments to protect beech trees so that they don't get infected by either the insect or the fungus?
As far as I know, no. Uh, there are like a number of other, with a number of other insects like the hemlock woolly adelgid, you can use some insecticides.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure actually with beech. I haven't actually heard anyone doing that, and maybe because we tend to think about beech more in a larger forest context where it might not be economical to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then how does, as the beech goes through these cycles of aftermath, what's the effect on wildlife? And presuming that there's a decrease in the beech nuts as mast for food.
That's actually been a real concern, I think, in New York State too, is particularly in our northern hardwoods, the beech nuts really provide a significant portion of that hard mast. And once those beech are gone, there isn't really anything taking its place. And I think I've actually heard, a lot of wildlife biologists advocate to even leave some of those, lingering diseased beech in there just for the mast production. So there is a little bit of a balance you might consider, if you're thinking about stand management, is that there might be an area maybe that's too far gone, or that, it isn't necessarily as productive, where you could maintain an area for that beech mass production.
Okay. Let's see, here's a question. Do you have any thoughts about trying to understand so I'll just read it. Any thoughts regarding good spacing of trees, good mixture of ages of trees, maintaining good drainage and nutrition of trees as opportunities for resistance breeding of beech trees? So maybe just kind of approach this from where you have resistance in beech trees. How does some of those things like tree age or tree spacing or tree nutrition influence the expression or the failure to express resistance to beech bark disease?
So the resistance is really a genetic factor, and obviously if you have resistant trees, it would be important to keep those pretty healthy, and in fact you might even want to collect some of the nuts from those trees. I'm not sure that in terms of site conditions, whether that has a huge effect on whether resistance is expressed or not. Because beech actually, unlike sugar maple, they can actually tolerate somewhat poor site conditions. Yeah, actually what would be beneficial probably in terms of maintaining proper drainage and nutrients is that it would actually help to promote some of the other species, the maple and the birch, that might require that.
Okay. Here's a question, a management question, and it gets at the notion of and I'm going to broaden the question. You showed the picture of the brush saw, and so I've heard about low stumping, which is cutting
Mm-hmm.
all the beech very close to the ground. Then I've heard about high stumping, which is the specific questions about cutting the beech 2 feet above ground.
Yeah.
And any thoughts on that? I mean, Ralph Nyland is an advocate, I think, with maybe some limited field trials, but is an advocate of low stumping. And at one point, he was an advocate also of high stumping, but I thought maybe he'd backed away from that. So, have you heard something different or experienced other things, or what about low stumping and high stumping?
So the only benefit, or the major benefit of high stumping, is that it reduces the number of stump sprouts that you'll get, which can be important too. But I'm not sure that it actually would reduce particularly root suckers that might develop afterwards. Yeah, that definitely came around while I was in Florida, so I'm not as familiar with the long-term impacts of the high stumping. But I think the only difference would be in terms of the actual, stump sprouts that are diminished with high stumps.
Okay. And then how about fire as a tool to control beech, juvenile beech?
Not so much. Well, actually, that's a good question. I don't know that we've actually really studied that enough. So, I worked a lot with fire in obviously while I was in the South, and fire can both promote woody vegetation or control it depending on the intensity of the burn. So for woody stems, shrubs, or trees that actually root sucker and sprout, you have to have a pretty hot fire to actually knock things back. And so that is probably would be the biggest challenge, is to have a hot enough fire that's going to kill that understory and that root system, but not be so hot that you scorch, the overstory trees. But yeah, I'm not sure that there has been much research on that. That would be interesting to think about, sort of what intensity of fire would be needed.
Okay, next question. My forest is currently in the killing phase. Should I be removing the few American beech I have with neonectria? Any other strategies I should consider?
That would probably be my recommendation. I know I usually don't like to recommend the whole scale removal of a single species, but if there is already evidence of the neonectria, and that it's developing some disease symptoms, it's not going to get any better. It's just going to get worse. So it probably would be beneficial to think about that removal. You're still going to stimulate a little bit of, you're still going to have a little bit of root suckering develop later. But it will, at least, particularly if you're at, really are in that sort of killing front, is that you might reduce the neonectria population by doing that. So one thing, I still would advocate to keep an eye out if you might have some of those resistant species, and you can probably tell at this point, if you have diseased trees, and to keep an eye out on ones that aren't diseased. You might want to maybe hold off on cutting those until you're certain.
Okay. And this was a kind of a comment. You had a slide that talked about unintended consequences subsequent to beech treatment. And how do you put, and I think you did a good job of capturing that, and saying, so yeah, you can go and you can manage the beech, but there are other things that can happen. Can you give guidance to a thought process that if you're standing in the woods as a landowner or a forester, and you're trying to decide what to do or what to recommend, what goes through your mind so that you can avoid some of those unintended consequences? What do you look for? What other information do you want to capture?
Mm-hmm. I mean, particularly if you're dealing with a large beech infestation, you might, what I kind of recommend is, and I'll talk about this with emerald ash borer too, is that you almost have to look at, is this understory beech treatment really like a low thinning, sort of like a mid-rotation sort of a treatment, or are you going to open up so much light into the area that you're almost regenerating a stand? So that's sort of how I think about it, is like understand what density and sizes and impact you're going to be having by removing all of that beech. Is it really just something like an intermediate treatment, or is it so far gone that maybe you should think about not just the beech removal, but regeneration in general? And then I would also, just like you were doing if you were going to do an inventory, is to maybe get a basic inventory of what's in your understory, because even if you have fern that's 500 feet away, that's that sign that perhaps, removing the beech is going to just release something else. So it's almost like having to go in and not just think about this as understory vegetation management. I think we tend to think about that like, oh, we're just going to, we're going to go treat the invasive plant now, or we're going to go herbicide the fern. But think about it in the larger context of the age of the stand, the trajectory of the stand, and are you really doing an intermediate treatment, an improvement treatment, or or maybe are you pushing maybe that regeneration method up a little bit further in the development of the stand?
Okay. Here's a question about says, I was told that disease beech trees with their cankers, quote, popping out, demonstrating some level of resistance to neonectria. Is this true?
Not that I'm aware of. Usually when you see that, that's a pretty good evidence that the neonectria has already infected the tree. That is usually the sign there's an infection and disease. So, but usually, like on the resistant trees, you might not even see the scale. So even, the little white puffs are sort of the telltale sign of the scale. And usually on the resistant trees, you're not even going to see much of that.
So where you do have resistant trees, how far away should you be to start managing culling the diseased ones? So presumably, the question is not about just cutting the diseased trees, but if you're using herbicides, and let's assume you're using a product that moves like glyphosate, how far away? What do you have some guidelines? And then Susan Stout responded to that question. I think about that question with noting that Dr. Marianne Faven has been working also with the Forest Service to develop some protocols on that. So do you any kind of like any reactions to that?
Yeah, so, well, the first thing I would suggest is that, as I mentioned, sort of the root suckers off of a parent tree tend to develop in the radius of about 30 to 40 feet of that parent tree. And so that's probably a good starting point, because obviously if you do have very documented resistant trees, you actually wouldn't mind if they sprouted a little bit. It's not gonna be the prolific sort of beech thicket that you would get from the diseased trees. So that might be a good sort of, if you think about a circular area around that resistant tree, that might be useful. Yeah, and then in terms of, where do you start the management with herbicides? I think probably the biggest concern would be if you're using a soil active herbicide like the triclopyr. So glyphosate isn't actually going to move very far in the soil. So probably, again, thinking about that 30-foot radius around the tree, that probably would be okay.
So I was thinking about the glyphosate moving within the root system of beech.
Oh, yeah, that's
So
true.
which I've killed beech through doing a cut stump treatment, killed beech 50 feet away from the treated tree. So I
Yeah, I
guess,
was going to say that's what I've seen with the cut stump treatment. So,
okay.
so that could add in,
And I
yeah,
don't know that that's
add to that
common,
process.
but if you have one tree and you think it's resistant, what you don't want to do is kill that one tree.
Yeah, that's
Like,
right. That's
oops.
right. Yeah. Because
Okay.
they will root graft sometimes.
Mm, okay. Andrea Hill says she has general protocols for protecting resistant beech and happy to share. So I can. Do you know Andrea Hill?
I do, yeah. She
Okay.
works for the Allegheny National Forest.
Okay. So maybe you can get a hold of her. We have a so just so you know, we have Kimberly, we have a blog site where we can post this and post, for example, your literature cited, so we
Okay.
can make that available to all the participants. Do you have experience or knowledge of beech response to mechanical treatments, such as with a Bronto or clearing saws? So I'm not Brontosaurus. Is that like a mastication, like a pulverizing head, or is that a slicing head?
Oh,
You
I
know?
don't know actually.
So maybe
But
Tom will have to clarify that.
yeah.
And we already talked about the clearing saws. So Andrea says, any thoughts at this early stage how beech leaf disease could interact with beech bark disease?
Yeah, so I didn't even get to that part, right? So
Right.
if for those of you who aren't familiar, there's if we don't have one thing affecting beech, it's another. And the beech leaf disease is actually something that's coming in from the west. So it's been detected in Ohio, and we've seen it in a couple places in Pennsylvania now. And I'm not sure if you have it in New York in a couple spots yet. Um, but I
Um,
think,
yeah,
yeah,
we've had, I think, unconfirmed reports.
okay. So there's certainly going to be some overlap in terms of these two diseases, and I probably uh, maybe it's some people say it's a good thing because the beech leaf disease will maybe knock back some of those root suckers on understory beech. So it'll definitely shift the dynamics, I think, of what's going on in our aftermath forests. I think this is, again, one of those too early to tell kind of situations, I think, in terms of how much mortality we're going to see from this beech leaf disease. So it could end up being that, just, again, we have more persistent species or more lingering disease beech.
Okay. Are there any biological controls for beech scale?
Uh, Not that I'm aware of. I'll have to actually look that up for the evening webinar.
Okay.
But
And then a follow up to that is, same person asks, can neonectria kill the beech in the absence of the scale?
it really needs the scale. That's basically what the scale does, is it bores into the tree. So obviously beech have a sort of a thinner bark, and the neonectria enters into those little bores. And I believe actually the scale carries the neonectria with it. So you do actually, I believe, need both of those components.
Okay, there's another question about fire. Um, there's a confirmation that the tall stump reduces stump sprouting.
Okay.
Uh, so here's a question from Jerry Michael, who I know, and he's asking latest advice on drill and fill versus hack and squirt. And I think what I'm guessing, but I think Jerry's referring to the drill and fill. We had done some experimental work where we drilled. Um, it was experimental because it was probably off label. Um, very large diameter holes and put essentially created a reservoir, a series of reservoirs in the base of the trees, of beech trees, and then filled them with glyphosate, thinking that that would provide a mechanism to disperse through the root system into the suckers. And the little bit of work that we did with that was not very encouraging. We used an enormous amount of chemical and took a long time to apply. So I'll say it's we're gonna continue and test that a little more thoroughly this summer. But at this point, I would go with the hack and squirt, using the glyphosate as a concentrate, where you can use one hack per 3 inches of diameter of tree diameter. So, okay, back to the questions. Can you talk about massed production of beech at all the various levels of disease? For example, will large disease trees still produce seeds? Do the thickets produce seeds? And when does beech start producing seed?
Yeah, so so the large disease trees, even the sort of medium-sized disease trees, actually will produce seeds, or will have this mass seeding. The thickets, no, because you're right that I think Emily is about right. It's in that 30 to 50-year-old time frame that beech starts producing seed, I believe. So maybe a little bit earlier in certain cases, but so in the thicket phase, not so much. But even those lingering, even a 5 or 6 inch trees, because obviously even something that small is probably on the range of 50 years old, anyways, will produce mass seeding. Yeah.
Okay. How does clear cutting work as a method to regenerate desirable species within the advancing front?
It works if you also, I guess, do some you might need to do some understory vegetation management. And I think actually in Maine, that was a big mechanism for doing a lot of their harvesting, was clear cutting, which again, when you clear cut, it's going to promote, for beech, it's going to promote that root suckering or stump sprouting. So where it will work is if you actually have some advanced regeneration of those desirable species that are also maybe in a little bit taller or in higher densities than the beech. So as I mentioned, maple actually in full light is going to respond better than beech does. Although from root suckers, sometimes it can be pretty even. So it works if you have advanced regeneration of what you want, but sometimes if you don't have that, then you're going to have a beech problem.
Right. That's what we did some trials with that, and we found that we grew some really good beech after clear cutting beech, which just wasn't the objective. But. Okay, so here's a question. I don't know if you know familiar with the phrase. I'm not. It says, any experience with brown and burn young thickets? So I don't know. Is that like is that browning them out with an herbicide and then burning them?
Yes, that's a southern thing.
All right. So
and in fact, actually. That brings me back to Florida. Yeah, we did that pretty commonly to control understory oak in pine systems, and understory shrubs. So that is actually, again, thinking about trying to increase that intensity of the fire, is that you can apply a herbicide treatment. So that browns out the material, it gets it drier, and then if you run a fire through it, that'll increase the heat a little bit. So that could actually, I see a nice little research study developing here.
There you go. So you talked about the basal bark treatments and showed pictures of that where, and the picture that I saw was different than what's described in the question, where you treat the full circumference for about 20 inches up from the base of the tree. Wondering, the question then is if you have any experience with streamline or thin line methods, which is just a band sprayed around the tree at about dBH.
Oh, I've heard not as much. Yeah, I don't have particular experience, or I haven't heard about that being done as much, I guess, for beech. I don't know if you have anything to
I
add.
I have not, no. So that
Okay.
might be a testable
Yeah.
hypothesis. So here's it say, uh, I think this was about Bill Leake did a study on single tree selection. So I think that
Mhm.
was what triggered this question. Um, is the trial area 70% disease free in 50 years? So presuming that it started, there was disease, but the
Yeah.
selection criteria removed the disease trees. And if that took 50 years to accomplish, and then if so, what was the frequency of what was the cutting cycle or the frequency of harvest entries?
Yeah. So I think that it was on a 10-year cutting cycle, um, either 5 or 10, but I'm pretty sure I recall it being 10. So with selection system, obviously you would go in pretty frequently. Yeah, and so it did take this. The results I showed you were sort of at the very end of 50 years of doing this kind of work. So it again takes multiple treatments to do that.
Okay. Here's I guess it'd be called a biocontrol question. Are there species of grass or maybe some other plants that could be grown in newly scarified soil that would reduce or prevent the establishment of beech?
Oh, that is a good question. Um, I kind of want to say no, and this is just my personal opinion. But yeah, it's a lot of times, when we do restoration, we try to promote some other herbaceous material, to try and control other things. But I'm not sure, um, herbaceous plants per se would control some beech sprout development. But this is again just sort of my personal opinion. I'm not sure I've seen much work on that.
Okay. Do you have any estimate on the cost for a cut stump treatment?
Um, no, I do not.
So there was
Usually,
Jim Kokender, was it Jim or Jeff? Jeff
yeah.
Kokendorfer, the son, Jeff Kokendorfer had a study in the early 2000s, and the, there was some cost, but it was offset by the cost or the value of firewood recovered. So they did that in that study. They cut everything 6 inches DVH and larger and treated it right away with a glyphosate-based product. And they were paying the loggers or whoever was doing the felling something like $12 or $15 an hour, and there was a small but positive net return to the landowner. So I, but I don't remember that. I mean, and in that, it says a Northern Journal of Applied Forestry article from either was it 04, 2004, 2006. So, but I don't remember the numbers specifically. Okay, so we do have confirmation that the Bronto head is a masticating head and it
Okay.
chips. So, any experience, um, any experiences with that as a treatment for beech?
I don't have experience with beech, but I actually have heard about this. We use this a little bit in the South for some other species, and that they they were actually looking at this versus sort of that shear saw, and I think that they found on some of the hardwood control down there that it does that masticating head again will prevent some of the stump sprouts from developing, because you don't have that sort of nice smooth surface where you get that root, the stump sprouts developing.
Okay, so there's one. Well, you met Brett Chedzoy. Brett has a farm where he had a fecon. There's some more. The people that are reading the questions see that there's some additional um, definitions of what a brontosaurus head is. Brett had something similar to that on a fecon, and it was unreplicated. It was just observational, but he felt like that there was less beech sprouting than what he would have expected following the fecon type head.
Uh-huh.
But that was not a research trial. That was a management action to to open up silvopasture. Okay, let's see. The final question. Here we go. This was like a great question and answer, Kimberly. Thank you for your patience. We've carried on for another 25 minutes. So the final question: does mast production decline on disease stems?
From what I've heard, or from a couple, like the study I cited there, it doesn't. Which one would think that you would have, obviously, on a diseased tree. They usually don't have as much resources to devote to the production. Although sometimes that's sort of a response mechanism. When you're dying, you throw out all new little seeds and reproduction. So the study that I cited there, I think they found that it was pretty similar production.
Okay. Yeah. So then there's a final comment, and John says the Brontosaurus works well on saplings and small pole beech. It reduces sprouting to some extent, but makes for a foliar treatment of sprouts possible, feasible in the second growing season when you get some adequate leaf surface area. So doing it as an integrated treatment, mechanical followed by chemical.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you to Kimberly and thank you to the audience. This was a fabulous discussion. We kept 90 of you all the way to the end. We peaked out at somewhere close to 180 participants, Kimberly, at the lunch hour. So that's a very fantastic showing, and you did a great job. I appreciate that. And Kimberly will be back if you want to see the again. Kimberly will be back at 7 o'clock for this evening. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy spring. Happy spring.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.